I bought the land right after I retired. 28 acres of dry grass, scruffy oaks, and enough space to finally breathe. After 20 years of crawling under Humvees and sleeping under stars that didn't care whether I lived or died, I wanted stillness. I wanted sky. I wanted something that no one could take from me. The property sat just outside the boundary of Maple Glen Estates, a cookie-cutter development with pastel stucco homes and a homeowners association that took itself far too seriously. That was part of the appeal, actually. Close enough to town if I needed supplies. Far enough that I wouldn't have to ask permission to paint my mailbox or mow my own field. Or so I thought. For the first 2 years, life was simple. I restored an old farmhouse. With my own 2 hands, cleared the brush, built a small barn. I even bought a used Massey Ferguson tractor from a guy in Amarillo. Old red dependable as Texas heat. I spent hours with that thing, smoothing out my dirt road, hauling firewood, and dragging feed bags to the back pasture. It wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of everything I'd earned, sweat equity freedom, and a rhythm of life no HOA could touch. But peace has a way of attracting people who hate silence. It started with flyers, folded glossy things from the HOA, stuffed into my mailbox. Neighborhood Beautification Committee meeting. Friendly guidelines for property presentation. I ignored them at first. I wasn't in their neighborhood. My land sat outside their jurisdiction. My taxes went to the county, not their little regime. Then came Karen. Karen Whitaker. Didn't look like a tyrant. She looked like every overtanned, overscented board president I'd ever been briefed about in base housing, oversized sunglasses, white SUV clipboard, like a weapon. She pulled into my gravel driveway one morning, uninvited, stepped out in wedges that sank into the dirt, and waved as if she belonged there. I was loading a bag of seed onto the trailer when she strutted over. "Hi there," she called out like she was already inside my life. "I'm Karen. I'm the president of the Maple Glen HOA just down the hill." I nodded. "Morning." Her smile twitched. She didn't like that I hadn't stopped working. "We've had some concerns raised about visibility from the road. That red machine of yours. Some residents say it's a bit of an eyesore." I stared at her for a beat too long. "That red machine's my tractor," I said. "And this isn't Maple Glen." "Oh, I know that," she said quickly. But the way she looked around, scanning like a general on reconnaissance, told me she didn't care. "But our neighborhood aesthetic really does matter. And since your land borders the entrance to our community, we were hoping you might consider moving it." I tightened the strap on the seed bag and kept my voice even. "I'll consider it, and I'll let you know." Her smile finally broke. "I'll give you my number," she said, reaching into her bag like she was performing magic. "In case you'd like to coordinate." I didn't take the card. I told her I had no interest in coordinating anything. I thanked her for stopping by, then I turned and went back to my barn. She stood there for a moment longer, like she couldn't believe I hadn't melted under her plastic charm. Then she left tires spitting gravel, not quite fast enough to call it a tantrum, but just enough to let me know she was insulted. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I found a letter in my mailbox, no postage, just stuffed in there like a passive-aggressive threat. It had the HOA's letterhead and some nonsense about community expectations and visual standards. It ended with a highlighted warning that continued non-compliance may result in action by the board. I laughed out loud. I called the county zoning office just to double-check, and sure enough, they confirmed what I already knew: my land wasn't under the HOA's jurisdiction. Not by an inch. The road leading up to my gate was county-maintained. The property line was clearly marked in the deed. Legally, they had no leg to stand on. I filed the letter away, just in case, old habit from the military. Document everything, even nonsense. But something about the tone of it stuck in my chest. I'd spent a career learning to trust my gut, and my gut told me this woman wasn't finished. I moved the tractor a few feet further down the drive, not to appease her, but to make room for a new delivery of gravel I had coming in. Still, the timing must have looked like submission to someone watching too closely. That's when the drone showed up, small, loud, and annoyingly curious. I caught sight of it while I was welding a hinge to the front gate. It hovered for a full minute over the tractor before buzzing back toward the HOA development like a digital hornet. I followed it with binoculars, watched it disappear behind the stucco houses of Maple Glen. I didn't know it then, but that little machine had taken photos close-ups, apparently, of the tractor tires resting near the easement, of tools laid out beside the barn, of whatever else they could twist into non-compliance. A neighbor down the road, Miss Connie, a retired teacher, called the next morning to say she'd overheard Karen at the post office complaining about that ex-military man who refuses to play by the rules. "She's obsessed with you," Connie said, half laughing. "Be careful. That woman makes us think about everything from porch lights to petunias." I told her I wasn't worried, that I knew the law, that the HOA had no teeth outside their lines. But deep down, something had shifted. Not fear, not yet, but the kind of alertness that comes just before a storm. I oiled the gate hinges. I checked the batteries in the motion lights. And that night, for the first time since retiring, I slept with one eye open. The next letter came in an envelope this time, official looking, glossy, embossed with a Maple Glen HOA seal, so shiny it nearly blinded me in the sun. Inside was a printed notice titled, "Second Violation Warning. Community Standards Enforcement Action Pending." This time it was signed, Karen L. Whitaker, President, Maple Glen Homeowners Association, on behalf of the board. It was as if she wanted me to know she had written it herself, like she was proud of the bold, absurd lie, printed halfway down the page. Chalfito. Your visible tractor continues to impact the cohesive aesthetic and visual tranquility of the Maple Glen residential environment. As such, you are now subject to potential HOA corrective measures per Article 4, Section 3 of the Covenant Agreement. I didn't need to finish reading to know it was garbage. There was no covenant agreement between me and Maple Glen. My property had never been part of their plat, never paid dues, and certainly never agreed to be governed by their board of lawn Nazis. But Karen didn't care about law. She cared about control. It wasn't just that she wanted the tractor gone. She wanted to prove that she could make it happen. That her word, her version of order, stretched beyond their painted sidewalks and manicured shrubs, that even the man on the ridge had to kneel. I didn't, and I wouldn't. Still, I wasn't going to let it slide. I scanned the letter, saved a copy to my cloud drive, printed one for my binder. Then I drafted my own reply, brief, formal, and legally sound, to whom it may concern. This property lies outside the jurisdiction and authority of the Maple Glen HOA, as confirmed by County Plat number 8821B and Property Deed LK 7098. Any further attempts to assert enforcement or conduct operations on my land will be considered harassment and reported to the appropriate authorities. Respectfully, Michael J. Trent, owner, 403 County Road 72. I slipped it in an envelope, walked it down to the HOA drop box by the Maple Glen Clubhouse, and slid it in with a satisfying snick. There were cameras, of course. I looked straight at one and smiled before I turned back toward my truck. I thought that would end it. I thought too highly of her. 2 days later, I came back from town with feed bags in the truck bed. As I crested the ridge, something felt wrong. The hum of cicadas was steady, the sky as cloudless as a clean sheet, but the wind was too still. No birdsong, no movement. Just this strange, sucking quiet. And then I saw it. The gate chain had been cut. The padlock lay on the ground, cracked open like a broken tooth. The gravel was disturbed, deep tire tracks I didn't recognize. And the tractor, it was gone. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd parked it elsewhere. Sometimes I left it at the barn or down by the creek when hauling logs. But the barn was empty. The field was untouched. I circled twice before the reality hit me like a cold slap. It had been taken. Not stolen, taken. I could see it in the way the drag marks veered toward the road, where the ditch had been flattened by heavier wheels. Someone had brought a trailer. Something big. And judging by the flattened grass and the oil mark at the mouth of the drive, they'd waited here for a while, probably during the heat of the day when I was down in Abilene, picking up fence posts and diesel. I stood there in the silence and tasted metal in the back of my throat. I wasn't angry yet. Not the shouting kind of angry. I was the kind of angry that settles low, cold, and precise. The kind that doesn't flinch. I'd felt it before, mostly in uniform. When a patrol didn't come back on time. When a convoy took a wrong turn. That quiet alertness that says, this isn't over. It just started. I walked the perimeter and confirmed the lock on the west gate had also been clipped. They came prepared. They didn't just yank it and run, they planned this. That's what made it worse. It was orchestrated, coordinated, not by criminals, but by someone who believed they had authority. And there was only one person who fit that description. I got in the truck and headed straight to the sheriff's office. That Sheriff Damon Callahan was a tall man with shoulders like oak beams and a handshake like a vice. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq, same as me, though we were in different battalions. We'd bumped into each other at the county fair one year, swapped stories over barbecue. He knew I didn't call in favors unless it mattered. That day, when I walked into his office with photos, papers, and a copy of the HOA's fake letter, he didn't ask dumb questions. He just said, "Tell me everything." I did. He sat in silence, flipping through the file like it was a mission dossier. He stopped at the surveillance photo I'd printed for my trail cam, a grainy but clear image of the tow truck parked by my gate. The driver wore a vest that said, Community Enforcement Services, a name I'd never seen before, but the license plate was visible. Damon wrote it down. "You think she hired them?" he asked. I nodded. "She threatened it. Twice. I've got her on camera." He raised an eyebrow. "Audio?" "No, but I've got the letters." "That should be enough for trespassing and maybe unlawful seizure." He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking. "If it's on your land and she ordered the tow, we're dealing with criminal trespass, possibly theft, and maybe impersonating a municipal officer if that enforcement service was claiming jurisdiction." I said nothing, just watched him work through it. Finally, he stood. "Let's go find your tractor." We drove out to the address registered to the towing plate, a fenced lot outside of town behind a shuttered landscaping business. Damon pulled in lights off. He was careful like that, tactical, a habit that never left him. The lot was quiet, chain link fence, no signage. But through the slats, I saw my red Massey Ferguson parked near a rusted trailer like a prisoner in a cell. Damon got out and knocked hard on the metal gate. After a minute, a lanky man in a reflective vest opened up, chewing something that looked too bright to be gum. "We're looking for the owner," Damon said. The man didn't answer. Damon showed his badge. Now, that got him moving. I stayed silent while they talked, watching the way the man's eyes kept flicking toward the tractor. Like he knew he shouldn't have it. "Who gave the order to tow it?" Damon asked. The man hesitated. "It was from Maple Glen. Some lady named Karen." I didn't smile, but I felt the first click of justice sliding into place. Damon looked at me. "We'll get it back, legally, on the record." He turned back to the man. "Tell your boss to expect a formal order by tomorrow, and leave that tractor exactly where it is." As we pulled away, the sun was setting over the ridge. Orange. Heavy. Righteous. Karen thought she'd won, but the war had just begun. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the couch, with my boots still on, eyes trained on the glow of the security monitor that flickered in the dark corner of the room. Every few seconds, one of the trail cams would switch views: the barn, the driveway, the south pasture. But the frame I kept staring at was empty, the flat rectangle of gravel where my tractor used to sit. I knew I'd get it back. Sheriff Callahan was a man who followed through, but what Karen had done, what she dared to do, rattled something deeper in me. Not fear, not helplessness, something more dangerous. Violation. It wasn't about the tractor anymore. It was about someone cutting my lock, stepping onto my land, and laying claim to something that was mine in broad daylight with no regard for boundary or consent. The last time I felt that kind of invasion, it was overseas in a convoy pinned under fire, with no air cover, and a command unit that didn't listen. That time I'd gotten out with scars and a few missing friends. This time it felt personal in a different way. It was my home, my silence, my chosen life now punctured by the arrogance of someone who believed her clipboard gave her the right to trespass. By sunrise, I was already in the barn taking inventory. I didn't just want my tractor back. I wanted to understand exactly how she'd done it, what she'd used to justify it, and how I could dismantle her entire plan legally, methodically, completely. The first thing I did was review every second of footage from the trail cams. 3 days earlier at 2:42 p.m., a white SUV with HOA decals rolled up to the gate. Karen stepped out, clipboard in hand. She was alone, wearing sunglasses and a beige pantsuit that didn't belong anywhere near a pasture. She stood there for several minutes talking into a phone. She gestured toward the barn, paced in a little triangle of gravel, like a hawk trying to figure out which rabbit hole to strike. At 3:08 p.m., the tow truck arrived. The company name was barely legible. Community Enforcement Services, LLC. A shell outfit with no public website, no licensing stickers, and a logo printed on magnetic decals slapped unevenly onto the driver's doors. The driver got out. Karen handed him a folder. Then just like that, he pulled out bolt cutters, snipped the gate chain, and drove in. No sheriff, no county permit, no legal paperwork. Just a handshake and Karen's authority. They didn't even bother to conceal it. The whole thing played out like some backwoods eviction, only this time the land didn't belong to them. I printed stills of every frame, annotated the timestamps, then cross-referenced them with my deed, which clearly marked the eastern boundary of my property. I even dug up a topographical map from when the previous owner had done a drainage study for a new fence line. All of it was solid. By noon, I had a binder 2 inches thick, labeled WETA, Unauthorized Seizure, Maple Glen HOA, in bold Sharpie. I wasn't just preparing to retrieve a tractor anymore. I was building a case. The next stop was City Hall. I walked into the county records department with a black binder in one hand and a clipboard in the other. The young clerk behind the desk name tag read, Kylie, looked up with a start when I introduced myself. I'm trying to file a formal complaint about an HOA overstepping jurisdiction, I said, keeping my voice calm. I need copies of Maple Glen's boundary filings, easement permissions, and any annexation requests from the last 5 years. She blinked. Are you a lawyer? No, ma'am, I said, smiling. Just someone who does his homework. It took her a while to dig up the documents, but when she did, they confirmed what I already suspected: the HOA had no claim on my land. In fact, their most recent annexation request, dated 2 years prior, had been denied by the county on the grounds that the proposed extension infringed on private agricultural parcels not subject to HOA oversight. That denial came with a little gold stamp. Rejected. I made 3 copies. Then I drove back out to the tow lot. The gate was locked this time. A hand-painted sign hung crooked on the chain-link fence. No entry. Private property. It would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. I didn't knock. I just parked across the road and waited. I'd called ahead this time, not to the lot, but to Damon. 15 minutes later, his cruiser pulled up behind me. He stepped out wearing his dark sunglasses, thumbs tucked into his belt. I've got the order, he said, holding a thick folder stamped with the sheriff's seal. Judge signed it this morning. Technically, the tractor's evidence, now until we sort out charges. Can I drive it back, I asked. He grinned. Better than calling another tow. A few more minutes passed before the lot owner shuffled out, eyes darting between Damon and me. He didn't say a word, just unlocked the gate and stood aside like a man facing judgment. I walked past him without a nod. There she was, my red Massey Ferguson, covered in dust but otherwise untouched. The key was still in the ignition. I climbed up, turned it over, and felt her purr back to life like a loyal hound waiting to come home. I backed her out slowly past Damon's cruiser, past the chain-link fence, past the man who'd sold himself for a cheap favor from a woman with too much time and too little law. But the moment we hit the road, a horn blared behind us. A white SUV swerved into view, skidding slightly on the shoulder. Karen. She jumped out before the engine stopped, heels grinding into gravel arms, flailing like some high-strung empress whose throne had been stolen. You can't do this, she shrieked. That's Maple Glen's property now. Damon turned toward her, cool as ice. Ma'am, step back. No, she yelled. He was warned. I have the bylaws. I sent the violation letters myself. I've seen them. Damon said, his tone clipped. They're not enforceable, and you're trespassing on county property right now. She stared at him like he'd spoken another language. I'm the HOA president, she barked, as if that meant something here. Damon didn't blink. And I'm the county sheriff. You want to file a claim, hire a lawyer. Karen's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. I put the tractor in gear, gave her a 2-finger salute, and rolled on down the road. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. But in the side mirror, I caught one last glimpse of her fists, clenched hair whipping in the wind, watching the symbol of her control rumble away slow and steady. It wasn't just a machine. It was a message. You don't own me. You never did. I parked the tractor behind the barn and cut the engine. The silence that followed wasn't the peace I'd hoped for. It was heavy like the air before a downpour, where the world seems to hold its breath. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped down, and I paused beside the hood, running my hand over the scratched red paint. She's back, I said out loud, to no one. But someone would have answered once. Years ago, my wife, Claire, used to joke that I talked more to that tractor than I did to people. She wasn't wrong. We'd bought it together the year she was diagnosed. Said it would be the start of our retirement dream, her growing lavender in the back fields, me grading the land and fixing fence posts, maybe raising goats if we got ambitious. She loved the smell of diesel and sun-warmed leather. Said it reminded her of her father's farm. That machine was part of our plan. She died before we could plant a single row. Cancer doesn't care about plans. After she passed, I kept going through the motions. Built the barn. Rewired the house. Kept our dog's old leash on the hook by the door even after he passed too. But the land stayed quiet, like it was waiting for her to come back and breathe life into it. I'd wake some mornings expecting her voice in the kitchen, only to find the same stillness. Just me, the wind, and the tractor. So when Karen took it, trespassed, invaded, seized something that still held Claire's touch, it wasn't just property. It was memory. It was sacred. That's what lit the fuse. Not pride, not ego. Love. I leaned against the side of the barn, letting the sun settle on my back. My hands were calloused. My bones ached more these days. But something deeper stirred now. A kind of mission. Not rage, just clarity. I hadn't felt this sharp since deployment. Karen thought this was about a machine, but I knew what it was really about now. It was about boundary, not the lines on a survey map, the invisible ones between right and wrong, between public and private, between what you're allowed to enforce and what you're trying to control. And she'd crossed all of them. That evening, I pulled up every county ordinance I could find. I made a fresh pot of black coffee, opened a yellow legal pad, and started taking notes. Property codes, land use rights, criminal trespass, unlawful seizure, private enforcement, impersonating municipal authority. I took photos of the padlocks that had been cut, of the fence damage. I uploaded everything to a hard drive and a cloud server just in case Karen got bold again. By 2 a.m., I had a file so tight a military inspector would have nodded in approval. I titled it, Maple Glen Incursion, Phase 1. The next morning, I visited Miss Connie again, my neighbor, 3 doors down. She'd lived in that house since before Maple Glen even existed. Her husband had died 10 years back, but she ran that place like a one-woman watchtower. If something happened in the area, she knew before the birds did. When I knocked, she opened the door already clutching a folder. "You're not the only one she's harassed," she said without greeting. "Come in." Inside, she handed me a stack of printed emails, all from other neighbors in the area. Notes about Karen threatening citations over backyard sheds, surveillance cameras randomly repositioned to face into people's homes, and in one case, a man named Alton, who'd nearly lost his garden shed because Karen filed a fraudulent safety complaint about fire hazards, which turned out to be a pile of compost. "She's been trying to expand the HOA boundary," Connie whispered like it was a conspiracy. "Rumor is she wants to get Maple Glen rezoned so it absorbs us. Says it'll unify the aesthetic." I nearly laughed, but it died in my throat. "She ever talked to you about my property?" I asked. Connie hesitated, then nodded. "She's obsessed with how unruly it looks. Said your tractor blocked the sightline to the entrance sign. That it brings down property values." I felt my jaw tighten. "I'll take these if that's all right," I said. "Take them," she replied, "and take her down while you're at it." Later that week, I called a meeting. Not a public one, not yet. Just a few of us who'd been targeted. Connie, Alton, the Velizal couple, who'd been fined for wind chimes, and old George, whose rain barrels had been declared unsightly by Karen's beautification committee. We met under the oak tree by my barn. It wasn't official, but it was real. I laid out the timeline of what happened with my tractor. I showed them the footage. I passed around the folder with the boundary maps and county filings. And I read the local statute that confirmed what I'd suspected: the HOA had no legal authority to take enforcement action outside of their declared development, especially not against private agricultural parcels. "What do we do now?" Alton asked, wringing his cap. "We document everything I said. Every letter, every call, every photo. Then we go to the county." George leaned forward. "You think the county will listen? They always side with these HOA types." I nodded. "They might, but they won't ignore evidence. And they damn sure won't ignore trespass with a bolt cutter." The group fell silent. But I could feel it, the shift, from frustration to resolve, from victims to something stronger. "You're not alone," I told them. "That's how she got away with it so long. One by one, we're easier to push. But together, we're a wall." Miss Connie nodded. "Time to build the wall, then." I grinned. Claire would have loved that. That night I stood on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. The breeze smelled like dry grass and cedar. I listened to the cicadas hum and watched the porch light flicker on automatically, another one of Claire's little touches. "You'd be proud of them," I said softly. "Of me too." I didn't expect an answer, but the wind picked up gently, brushing past me like an old friend. And for the first time in weeks, I exhaled without tension. Karen thought she'd shaken me, but all she'd done was wake up the part of me that knew how to dig in. That knew how to fight, not with noise, but with precision. And this time, I wasn't doing it for war. I was doing it for home. 2 days after we retrieved the tractor, I drove down to the county sheriff's office again. Not because I didn't trust Damon to follow through, quite the opposite. I just knew the next steps needed precision, and this wasn't something I was going to let slip into a bureaucratic gray area. Karen was still out there fuming behind her spotless hedges, no doubt scheming about how to spin the situation. I wasn't going to give her the chance. When I stepped into the building, the front desk deputy waved me through without a word. Damon was already waiting, sitting at his desk with a thick manila folder open and a fresh pot of coffee steaming on the side table. "You weren't bluffing," he said, nodding toward the binder I handed over. "Never do," I replied. He pulled out the top page and whistled. Timeline photos, correspondence, trail cam stills, recorded calls. Hell, Mike, this is cleaner than what half my guys put together for court cases. I gave a modest shrug. Old habits die hard. He smirked. "You should have been a lawyer." I sat down across from him. I was trained to keep people alive. Now I just want to keep what's mine. He sifted through the evidence, slowly, thoughtfully. Every few pages he nodded. Then he pulled out the aerial maps, the ones I'd had blown up from the county records department, with the HOA borders highlighted in yellow, and my property marked clearly in blue. "These are solid," he said. "No way they can argue jurisdiction." "I know. But Karen doesn't work in facts. She works in intimidation." Damon's expression hardened. "She tried it with my niece, actually," he said. "Back when she moved into Maple Glen, fined her for a doghouse that was 6 inches over some imaginary setback line." "You serious?" "Dead serious. Girl nearly sold the place until we sorted it out. Karen's a shark with no water to swim in, so she starts flopping onto dry land." He sat back and tapped his pen against the edge of the folder. "With your permission, I'm going to hand this to the AUDA's office. There's enough here to press criminal trespass and unauthorized property seizure. Maybe even impersonating a municipal officer, depending on what we find out about that fake enforcement outfit." I nodded. "Do it. But I'm telling you," now he continued, "she's going to come at you harder after this. Not physically, but she'll stir the pot. Press releases, calls to the paper, maybe even slander." "She already has," I said, pulling out my phone. I showed him a clip someone had sent me, a Facebook Live video Karen had posted the night before. It was just her, standing in front of a hedge wall with the HOA clubhouse behind her, talking into the camera like she was hosting a local news segment. Today we faced resistance from a disgruntled individual whose property has long been a source of disruption to the peace and visual consistency of Maple Glen. She'd said, her tone syrupy. "We remain committed to protecting the integrity of our neighborhood and will pursue all available remedies to ensure our rules are respected." Damon chuckled. That woman could have made a fortune in propaganda. She doesn't know what's coming. He turned to his laptop and began drafting an incident report. "Let's make sure the law does." Later that afternoon, I drove back home and pulled up every security camera angle I had. I didn't just want confirmation of the tow, I wanted the sound, the words. Karen's exact language in her own voice. I found it on the barn cam. There she was standing just inside the fence phone to her ear, gesturing toward the tractor like she was giving orders to a platoon. I cranked the volume and listened. "Yes, it's on the gravel next to a red shed. No, he's not here. Yes, you can proceed." Pause. "No, it's within our boundary." I checked. "He's supposed to be under our HOA. We're doing this to protect property values." I paused the footage, heart pounding. That was it. That single sentence, "It's within our boundary. He's supposed to be under our HOA," was the lie she used to authorize the tow. It was false, deliberate. And now it was recorded. I clipped the segment and saved it. Labeled it, "Karen Lie, Audio MP4. Then I sent it to Damon. Within minutes, he texted back, "This seals it. We're moving forward." That night, I got a knock at the door. It was Alton, hat in hand, looking nervous. "I heard she's been telling people you threatened her," he said. Saw a post in the neighborhood group said you intimidated a public official and illegally reclaimed property. I nearly laughed. Public official, she's a volunteer president of a homeowners association, not the governor. She's spinning hard, Mike, he said, frowning. I think she's scared. And scared people are dangerous. I'm not scared, I said simply. But truthfully, I was tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, the kind that settles into your bones when you realize how many people believe lies simply because they come dressed in authority. I looked at Alton. You still have those emails from her, the ones where she warned you about your fence. He nodded. Good, make copies. You'll want them. For what? I opened the folder labeled Phase 2 and slid it across the table. We're going public. The next morning, I contacted a local journalist. Her name was Janice Klein. Mid-40s, smart as hell, and known for writing clean fact-based stories that the local paper rarely dared to touch unless they'd been triple verified. I sent her the footage, the maps, the audio, the community emails, everything. She called me the same evening. This is going to get messy, she said. I'm counting on it. She paused. Why now? I told her the truth. Because people like Karen count on silence. And the only way to shut them down is to drag them into the light. She asked for one quote for the article. I gave her what I knew, deep in my gut. You can't just invent power and expect people to obey it. Not here. Not anymore. The article dropped 3 days later. Front page of the county section. HOA overreach. Sparks outrage. Tractor seizure raises legal questions. Karen's name was in the second sentence. The audio quote ran in full. Damon's statement was included along with his confirmation that an investigation was active. Connie Alton and George were all mentioned as other affected residents. The story was fair, not dramatic, but devastating in its clarity. The fallout was immediate. Karen called a board meeting the next night trying to spin the narrative. But the footage had done its job. People saw her for what she was. The sheriff's investigation had teeth now. And I wasn't just the man with the red tractor anymore. I was the one who said no, and made it stick. The morning after the article went live, I opened my front gate to find a handwritten note taped to the fence post. Oh, thank you for standing up. She's been doing this for years. If you ever need a witness, I'm in. It was signed only with a first name, Patricia. There was no address, no phone number, but I didn't need one. Maple Glen had over 70 homes, and I knew I'd find Patricia, or more likely, she'd find me. I left the note pinned right where it was, like a quiet flag, and went inside to start the coffee. By noon, 4 more neighbors had reached out. One of them was a woman named Della, whose backyard garden had been reported anonymously for unregulated agricultural activity. She showed me the notice Karen had issued, claiming that her tomatoes and basil violated aesthetic uniformity and could attract pests. She's been trying to push me out, Della said. Offered to help me relocate last year. Said Maple Glen would give me a small relocation grant if I sold before spring. That's not enforcement, I said. That's coercion. She nodded. Exactly. I added her documents to the binder and told her to hang on to the originals. The pile was growing thicker by the day. I didn't expect what happened next. A man knocked on my door just before sunset. Tall, mid-60s with silver hair and eyes that didn't blink much. He wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and the kind of boots that don't shine anymore no matter how well you polish them. You Michael Trent, he asked. That's me. He stuck out his hand. Name's Ray. He hesitated. I'm on the Maple Glen HOA board. Well, was. They're voting me out next week, he said. Karen's pulling strings to have me removed for conflict of interest. All because I asked to see the towing contract. I stepped aside and offered him a seat on the porch. Over the next hour, Ray told me everything. Karen had joined the HOA board 5 years ago, after moving into the neighborhood from Phoenix. Within months, she'd rewritten half the guidelines, removed old clauses that required public votes, inserted language about board discretion, and changed fine structures from $25 per incident to $150 with compounding penalties. She did it fast, Ray said. Most of us didn't even realize what was happening until she started enforcing the new bylaws like they were law. At first, people went along with it the way folks do when someone seems organized and confident. But over time, the cracks began to show. Karen's enforcement was uneven. Her targets weren't random. They were people who didn't kiss the ring. Veteran single parents, older residents who didn't speak English fluently. Anyone who pushed back got slapped with violations. And that towing company I asked, her cousin's kid Ray said. She paid him through discretionary board funds, no vote. Just slipped it in under Community Enforcement Services. I shook my head. That's misuse of HOA funds. Ray handed me a USB stick. Board meeting recordings, last 6 months. Some of it's revealing. I took it with care, like it might burn a hole through my fingers. You sure about this? Ray looked me in the eye. I kept quiet too long. My wife, she said if I didn't speak up, I was part of the problem. She's right. She usually is. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind through the trees. I realized then I wasn't alone, not in theory, not in hope, in action. The tide was shifting. Karen had ruled through division through the illusion of process and paperwork and polished language. But now the structure was cracking, not from the outside, from within. That night, I listened to the recordings. I heard Karen belittle residents, mock complaints, shut down board members mid-sentence. In one meeting, she outright admitted she didn't care what the county zoning office says because HOA regulations are stronger than outdated county rules. The room had gone quiet after that, but no one challenged her. Until now. I clipped the best segments, labeled the files, uploaded them to my backup folder titled Board Evidence, K. Whitaker. Then I sent copies to Damon Janis, the reporter, and after a long pause to a contact I hadn't spoken to in years, an old Army buddy turned state investigator named Nolan Fry. Nolan responded in under an hour. This is good. Want me to loop in the AG's HOA fraud unit? I stared at that message for a while. Then I wrote back one word, yes. The fallout began slowly, like the first few drops of rain before a flood. First came the internal board email leak. One of the members, probably Ray, forwarded a thread to Janice showing that Karen had pushed through expense authorizations without majority consent, thousands of dollars toward enforcement operations, and consulting fees with no receipts attached. Then, the sheriff's office formally requested HOA financial records under a court order tied to misuse of funds. Karen tried to spin it all as a personal vendetta in another Facebook post. Claimed I was a disgruntled ex-resident with a grudge. But her comments section told a different story. Dozens of homeowners chimed in with screenshots, letters, even photos of Karen inspecting properties at 6 a.m. without notice. The illusion of her authority, the tidy mask she'd worn, was disintegrating in real time. By the end of the week, a petition circulated to remove her from the board. It had 58 signatures in 3 days. She panicked, started calling emergency board meetings, sent out 3 mass mailers about dangerous anti-Tadal community actors. But people weren't buying it anymore. They'd seen the body cam footage, heard her voice on the recordings, watched the way she screamed when the sheriff returned the tractor like it was a crown stolen from her kingdom. The spell was broken, and I knew it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person she'd silenced, every neighbor she'd pushed to the margins. And now they were finding each other, organizing, sharing stories. The woman who once ruled through fear was now drowning in facts, and I wasn't holding the line alone. I had an army. It was a Monday when the sheriff called. Thought you'd want to be there, Damon said. We're executing the second warrant this morning. This time we're going through the HOA records directly. Financials, towing contracts, everything. You mind coming along? Wouldn't miss it, I said. I didn't ask if Karen knew. I hoped she didn't. I wanted her to be blindsided, to feel what it was like to have your world upended, not by brute force, but by the slow, unstoppable march of truth. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my evidence binder, and climbed into my truck. The air was brisk, the sky clear. A rare, perfect day. The kind Claire would have called clean sky weather. The kind where nothing hides in shadow. As I turned onto the main road leading into Maple Glen, I saw the first signs of unraveling. Yard signs that once read, Proud HOA Community, were now missing or torn out. Windows that used to hold neat little HOA newsletters now displayed handwritten notes in Sharpie. No trespassing. No unauthorized inspections. We support our neighbors. It was no longer my fight alone. When I pulled up to the HOA office, a squat beige building tucked behind the clubhouse Damon's cruiser was already parked out front, alongside 2 county vehicles. Ray was there too, standing tall, arms crossed. His expression unreadable. You ready? Damon asked. I nodded. One deputy knocked on the door. No answer. They waited the required 10 seconds, then used a key the HOA treasurer had turned over voluntarily the night before. The door opened with a boff click, and all at once the smell of overused air freshener and fresh toner hit me. The office was eerily quiet. Folders neatly stacked, framed motivational slogans hung on the wall. Order is peace, community above all, and the most ironic one of all. Integrity is the backbone of leadership. Let's get to it, Damon said. The deputies moved with precision. One photographed everything, while the others cataloged files and removed hard drives per the warrant. Karen was nowhere to be seen, but I knew she wouldn't stay gone long. Sure enough, 20 minutes in, tires screeched outside. A white SUV slammed to a stop and the driver door flung open, so hard it bounced. Karen stormed into the office like a queen returning to find her throne overrun. "What is going on here?" she shrieked. Damon didn't even flinch. "We're executing a search warrant for documents related to illegal property enforcement and financial misconduct under HOA authority." "You can't do that. This is private property." "No, ma'am," he said calmly. "This is an incorporated HOA office, funded by resident dues and subject to public governance standards under state HOA statutes. You know that." Karen's eyes darted around as if searching for someone who might leap to her defense. But no one moved. The board treasurer, a man named Steve, I'd never seen before, stood silently near the filing cabinet, arms limp at his sides, face pale. "I demand to speak to an attorney," Karen snapped. "That's your right," Damon said, handing her a copy of the order. "You'll see the judge's signature at the bottom. We're also taking custody of the HOA's towing contract records. You might want to read that part closely." She glanced at the page, and for the first time her voice faltered. "Are you arresting me?" "Not today," Damon said, walking past her toward the copier room. "But that's not up to me anymore." Karen turned toward me like I'd summoned this storm myself. Her eyes narrowed, lips curling into something between disgust and desperation. "This is personal," she hissed. I stepped forward, keeping my voice even. "No, Karen, this is overdue. You think you're some hero, some cowboy vigilante. No, I think I'm a man who got tired of watching people like you turn good neighborhoods into fiefdoms. And I'm not the only one." She stepped closer. "You have no idea what you've done." "I do," I said. "You just didn't think anyone would push back." Later that afternoon, the files were sealed and transported. Janice the reporter was already outside when we exited. Her notepad was in one hand, her phone in the other. She didn't need to ask questions. The footage spoke for itself. Karen tried to stop her, told her it was illegal to film, that she was violating a private institution's privacy. Janice raised one eyebrow. "You ran for public office, Karen. HOA board president is a public designation under state code. And this is news." Karen screamed, actually screamed. A high-pitched, wordless sound of frustration that echoed off the clubhouse walls like a siren of her own unraveling. A few homeowners emerged from nearby porches. They didn't say a word, just watched. She stomped back to her SUV and slammed the door so hard the vehicle rocked. "She'll file a counterattack," Ray muttered beside me. "She's probably drafting a cease and desist right now." "She's running out of paper," I said. And it was true. The sheriff's office had everything. Now emails, letters, surveillance footage, internal board recordings, and proof of unauthorized use of HOA funds. Even if the DA moved slowly, public pressure was mounting fast. A community vote to dissolve Karen's authority had been scheduled. Posters went up by the mailboxes. Neighbors who'd once nodded politely now spoke freely in groups on porches, in the HOA's own Facebook group, which had been taken over by residents demanding transparency. The tide wasn't just turning. It had already turned. That evening, I sat out on my back porch sipping coffee, watching the sun dip below the ridge. Claire's old wind chimes sang in the breeze. The tractor sat quietly by the barn, its engine cool, its presence solid and unquestioned. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Karen's war had been loud letters, threats, fines, public humiliation. But our resistance had been quiet, grounded in truth and patience. Like most real work, the kind you do with soil and wire and calloused hands, it didn't make headlines. It made progress. I got a call from Nolan just before sundown. "They're reviewing the case at the state level," he said. "I can't promise anything, but it looks like a formal review panel's coming." What does that mean? It means Karen might not be the only one held accountable. If the HOA board members signed off on any of those authorizations, they're in trouble too. Trouble. "What about me?" He paused. "You're clean. In fact, they're thinking about inviting you to speak at the state HOA reform conference next quarter. Want your story told." I laughed. I didn't do this for a podium. No, he said. But sometimes the people who don't chase it are the ones worth hearing. I hung up and let the stillness return. Karen had tried to strip me of my voice, but I'd used it not to shout, but to name the truth. And now everyone could hear it. By the end of the week, the clubhouse looked like a ghost town. The once manicured hedges were overgrown. The welcome flags had been taken down, and the newsletter box outside sat empty. For the first time in years, the community message board didn't have a new HOA memo thumbtacked to it. Just a piece of paper with duct tape and a black marker in bold letters. Emergency board meeting canceled. President under investigation. It was signed, Acting Secretary Maple Glen, HOA. That morning, the HOA's Facebook group, once moderated solely by Karen, was rebranded. The banner image of pastel houses under a blue sky had been replaced by a stark white background with 3 words. Accountability starts here. It wasn't just her policies people had turned on, it was her presence. The community was tired, not of governance, but of being ruled, and Karen wasn't built for transparency. I knew it was only a matter of time before she broke, and when she did, she broke loud. Janice published her follow-up piece the following Monday. This one was harder hitting, less cautious. She had the receipts now, HOA expense reports, that showed tens of thousands in discretionary payments to community enforcement services, all without board vote. She had interviews with at least a dozen residents who'd been harassed, fined, or surveilled. She had the leaked audio from that board meeting where Karen said, laughing, "No one reads the bylaws. We just tell them what they want to hear." And then came the kicker. Karen's cousin, the one who owned the towing company, had a previous conviction for fraud in Tahoe, Arizona. He wasn't licensed in Texas for repossession work. The seizure of my tractor had not only been unauthorized, it had been executed by someone legally barred from the business. Janice's headline didn't hold back. HOA president orchestrated illegal seizures using unlicensed contractor, leaked files show. The article went viral. Within 12 hours, it had been shared over 400 times. Local radio picked it up. By nightfall, it had reached a regional TV station. And Karen went live. She stood on her perfectly trimmed lawn, wearing a pale blue blazer like she was hosting a press conference. Someone, probably her teenage son, held the phone. Her voice was shaking, but she kept trying to smile. "I have always acted in the best interest of this community," she said, blinking too much. "And now I'm being unfairly attacked by individuals who have chosen to twist facts and ignore our shared vision for order and safety." A car drove by in the background and someone shouted, "You're a crook, Karen." She flinched but pressed on. The recent articles are biased and filled with misinformation. The so-called victims are people who refused to comply with reasonable rules. We have standards for a reason. Then came the part that no one expected. She turned to the camera, face tight. "And as for Mr. Trent, the man parading around as some kind of moral guardian, let's be clear. He is a disruptive force. His property has always been a blight. His presence has undermined the fabric of our peaceful neighborhood." That's when the second voice came in. Off-screen, a woman yelled, "He served this country. What did you ever serve? Karen yourself." Karen's composure cracked. She spun toward the voice. "This is private property. You don't get to heckle me in my own yard." The live stream ended with her shouting into the street. That clip, just 37 seconds long, was reposted dozens of times. On Facebook, on Nextdoor, on Twitter. Someone added music. Someone else made a parody where her words were cut into a rap. HOA Karen's Greatest Hits, the title read. The damage was done, but social embarrassment wasn't the real endgame. That came the next morning when the Watt District Attorney's Office made a public statement confirming that Karen Whitaker was under active investigation for criminal trespass, misuse of funds, and unlawful property seizure. It was unprecedented for a case like this. Most HOA scandals got buried under private settlements and procedural reviews, but the visibility, the public evidence, the pressure, it had forced their hand. At the same time, the Maple Glen HOA board announced an emergency vote of no confidence. Members had the choice to either remove her or face potential dissolution of the HOA charter itself. No one wanted that. Not even Ray, who had been the most vocal about dismantling the HOA entirely. "This isn't about ending the structure," he told me that afternoon. "It's about burning out the rot." That evening, I received a certified letter. It was from Karen, hand-signed. Cease and desist. Defamation, and harassment. I laughed, out loud, alone in my kitchen. I opened the envelope, skimmed the half-baked legal language, and then picked up the phone. "Nolan," I said when he answered. "I just got a cease and desist." There was a pause. Then he said, "She's panicking." That's a good sign. Can I ignore it? Frame it. At the emergency vote, Karen showed up. Barely. She didn't speak, didn't smile. Just sat stiffly in the folding chair at the back of the room while neighbors cast their ballots. There was no fanfare. Just a quiet, steady handoff of control the way real justice moves. When the results were read aloud, 7 in favor of removal, 2 abstentions, and 0 opposed. Karen stood up, turned, and walked out without a word. The new interim president, a retired librarian named Marcia Pierce, stood at the front and said something I'll never forget. "We built this community together. Let's never again let one person make us forget that." That night, I walked my property line. The stars were out in force, bright, sharp, defiant, against the dark. The wind was high, rustling through the trees like applause. At the edge of my driveway, I found the old violation sign Karen had planted months ago. "Vehicle in violation. Must be removed." It had been tossed into the ditch at some point during all the chaos. Mud-caked, sun-bleached, forgotten. I picked it up, took it to the barn, nailed it to the wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. That silence is not peace, and peace is not weakness. Sometimes peace is a man in worn boots, standing alone on his land, saying no and not moving. In the weeks following Karen's ousting, a strange calm settled over the neighborhood. Not silence, but clarity. For the first time in years, people talked without whispering. The HOA Facebook group turned from a tool of control into something surprisingly hopeful. People asked for gardening advice, shared photos of their dogs. Someone even posted a recipe for peach cobbler that went semi-viral among the retirees. But beneath the friendly surface, the real work had only just begun. Karen may have been gone, but the system she'd twisted was still standing. The bylaws she'd rewritten, still on the books. The contracts she'd signed, still active. And the fines she'd levied, some of which had led to actual property liens, were still hanging over the heads of folks who couldn't afford lawyers to fight back. So I got to work again, not as a vigilante, as a man who finally understood how deep the damage ran, and who now had the community standing beside him. I started by meeting with Marcia, the new interim HOA president. She greeted me with strong coffee and a stack of old minutes from board meetings that Karen had conveniently kept off the public record. "Some of these aren't even signed," she said, frowning. "And I think she forged the ones that are." I flipped through the stack and spotted it immediately, a resolution declaring HOA jurisdiction extended to the outer pastures, including properties like mine, that had never opted into the HOA. It was dated 18 months ago, signed only by Karen and one other member who had since resigned. "No board vote," I said. "No resident consent. This is void." Marcia nodded, but she used this to justify the towing, to find the Velez family, to issue a cease order on George's rain barrels. It's been the foundation of everything. "Well," I said, pulling out my phone, "we're going to tear that foundation down." I started with the Bott County Court. The same binder I'd given the sheriff's office now expanded to include the forged resolutions, interview transcripts, and a breakdown of falsified fine records became part of an official civil complaint. Trent versus Maple Glen Homeowners Association. But I didn't sue for damages. I sued for policy reform. The aim wasn't to take money. It was to take power back from a flawed system. We petitioned to have all HOA amendments made during Karen's tenure suspended pending full audit. We demanded an independent review of all citations issued in the last 3 years. And most importantly, we sought legal clarity on jurisdiction to make it crystal clear that no HOA could retroactively claim authority over non-enrolled landowners. The case took weeks to process, but it stirred attention fast. Within a month, homeowners across the county were asking for copies of our filing. Several had their own horror stories. An elderly couple fined for putting a wooden bench in their front yard. A single father who'd been told he couldn't fly an American flag unless it matched the approved neighborhood color palette. Even the state office of HOA oversight, typically quiet and understaffed, took notice. Nolan called to tell me the file had landed on a state investigator's desk. "They're using it to model future reform policy," he said. "You might have just kicked off something bigger than your tractor." I didn't smile. I just said, "Good." Meanwhile, Karen went silent. Her once daily social media posts vanished. Her SUV was no longer parked in her driveway. Some neighbors said she was staying with relatives. Others said she'd lawyered up. I didn't care. What mattered was that she was out, and the people she'd hurt were no longer afraid. One by one, the board began undoing her damage. All fines issued without full vote were rescinded. All contracts signed without board approval were suspended. And a new committee was formed, one focused not on aesthetics, but on restorative policies. Policies that prioritized community, not control. They even asked me to chair it. I said no, not because I didn't care, but because I'd fought my war. Now it was their turn to rebuild. Instead, I focused on helping my neighbors. I met with the Velez family and helped them draft a letter to the Watt County assessor to remove the illegal lien from their records. I spent 2 afternoons with George showing him how to file a small claims counteraction against the HOA for damage to his water system. And one Sunday, I helped Alton put up his fence, the same fence Karen had declared a visual obstruction. We built it strong, clean, and exactly 2 inches within legal limits. Just to make a point, as we hammered the last nail, he looked at me and said, "I didn't think people like us could fight back." I stared out over the hills. "We can," I said. "We just don't realize it until someone pushes us too far." In late October, I got a letter. It was from the State Advisory Panel on HOA Governance. They were inviting me to speak at a legislative roundtable in White Austin. A special hearing on HOA abuse cases and proposed regulatory reform. They'd read the article. They'd reviewed my case. They wanted my story on the record. I stared at the letter for a long time. Claire would have said yes in a heartbeat. So I did too. The day of the hearing, I stood before a semicircle of state representatives and read from prepared notes. But halfway through, I set the pages down and spoke plainly. "I'm not here because I hate HOAs," I said. "I'm here because no one, not a board, not a president, not a neighbor with a clipboard, should have the power to take what doesn't belong to them and call it order." I told them about the tractor, about the lock they cut, the lies they told. The neighbors too scared to speak. And then I told them what came after the nights on the porch, the files passed hand to hand, the strength of quiet people rising up together, not to burn down their community, but to take it back. When I finished, there was silence. Then came the applause. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, sincere. I drove home that night, with the windows down, wind brushing against my face. The road back to the ridge was quiet, except for the hum of tires and the far-off bark of a dog. The stars were out again, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like they were shining for something, not just above it. I passed the barn, slowed near the oak tree, and saw someone had tied a yellow ribbon to the old gatepost. A simple gesture. No name. But I understood it. This land, my land, had been tested, and it had held, not just through courts or papers or news stories, but through people. Good people. The kind who show up with coffee and questions, with courage and fence posts, the kind who remind you what home really means. Winter came late that year. The fields stayed green longer than usual, and the morning air, while crisp, never quite bit through the jacket the way it used to. It was as if the land, like the people on it, had been waiting to exhale. And now, after so many months of tension, something softer was finally allowed to take root. Maple Glen was different. Not perfect, but different. Gone were the frantic memos about lawn color palettes and mailbox standards. The board meetings, once dominated by intimidation and jargon, now featured open discussion, coffee, and sometimes laughter. I didn't attend them, but I'd hear about them from Ray or Miss Connie. Folks said the HOA had gone from a machine to a mirror, something that reflected the community instead of trying to mold it. And as for Karen, she sold her house quietly in December. No big announcement, no goodbye party. Just a moving truck one Wednesday morning and a for sale sign, replaced by a sold sticker before sundown. Some said she moved back to Phoenix. Others said she was staying with family upstate, working remotely, keeping her head down. Me, I never asked. Some ghosts you let drift away on their own. The state hearing led to change. By early spring, the HOA Reform Bill, one I'd helped shape with my testimony, passed with bipartisan support. It mandated stricter oversight of HOA boards, clearer boundaries between public and private land, and penalties for any HOA attempting to enforce outside its jurisdiction. It even included what the committee called the Trent Clause language that prevented HOAs from unilaterally annexing properties without a signed agreement and full county approval. My name wasn't on the bill, but I didn't need it to be. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the barn staring at the wall where I'd mounted that old violation notice, the one Karen had slapped on my tractor like a badge of shame. I took it down, not because I was erasing history, but because I didn't need the reminder anymore. The scar had healed, and the ground had grown back stronger where it had been torn. Spring brought color back to the ridge. The lavender patch Claire once dreamed of had finally started to bloom. Not all of it, just a small section I'd planted last fall when no one was looking. It wasn't much, but it was hers. I'd sit by it some evenings with my thermos of coffee and the sound of the wind in the grass and think about how far we'd come. How a woman with a clipboard and a lie had almost stolen not just a tractor, but a whole community's sense of peace. Almost, but not quite. Because peace, real peace, isn't quiet compliance. It's knowing where you stand and standing there even when you're alone, especially when you're alone. In early May, the county hosted a Community Heroes Night. I wasn't planning to attend, crowds weren't my thing. But Marcia showed up at my gate with a plate of brownies and that look in her eye that told me I didn't have a choice. When I walked into this community center, people clapped. I didn't know what to do with my hands. Someone had printed out a massive photo of me on the tractor the day the sheriff brought it back. I looked older than I remembered, but also steadier, grounded. The mayor gave me a plaque. Janice gave me a wink. Damon gave me a sulk or a slow nod from the back of the room. And then, something unexpected happened. Miss Connie stepped up to the mic, cleared her throat, and read a letter. It was from Claire, an old note she'd written during one of their weekly teas before she passed. In it, Claire had described her dream for the Ridge, a place where people took care of each other, where land was respected, and no one ever felt small for speaking up. She told me once Connie read that Michael doesn't raise his voice. He raises standards. I closed my eyes for a moment and let it wash over me. Not the applause, the peace. That night, I walked the property line one last time before bed. The wind was soft. The stars were bright. Somewhere down in Maple Glen, a wind chime played a familiar tune. I looked out at the fence we'd rebuilt, at the gate we'd reinforced, at the barn that still stood even after everything. And I realized something. Karen had tried to take something from me, something she never truly understood. Not the tractor, not the land, but the silence I had earned. The silence of a man who no longer had to fight to be heard, because now the whole town was listening. And I didn't need to shout. I just needed to stay, planted, present, rooted like the trees we fought to keep. That in the end was the justice. Not the lawsuits, not the policy changes, not even the plaque in my living room. But this moment, here, now, where everything was still, and nothing, no Karen, no board, no badge-wearing volunteer tyrant could take it away again. Not ever.